This lesson is dedicated to a very special kind of noun group of nouns that are called segolates. In Hebrew, segolates are nouns that are two syllables with penultimate stress. We have lots of these words in Hebrew, and a lot of them are spelled with two segols. That's kind of the reason that they're called segolates. We have words like melech, yeled, derech, kesef, regel, delet, kelev, beged, and lots more. So all of these are two syllable nouns with penultimate stress. They're segolates. Now, segolates are interesting because there's a change of vowels whenever a segolate takes a pronominal suffix. And take, for example, melech. You add the pronominal suffix o. You could add any of them, but let's just use o. And for some reason, the result is malko. Where did this patach come from? We start with two segols, and then all of a sudden there's a patach when we add a pronominal suffix. Why? Well, okay, this could be confusing until you realize that the form of the word with the pronominal suffix actually preserves the more original form of these segolates, these group of nouns called segolates. Okay, what do I mean by that? All right, a little bit of background will be necessary to understand what's going on here. Long ago, nouns in Semitic languages had case endings, three of them. Now, if you know anything about cases, they tell you about how a noun functions in a sentence. Here are a few of them. The nominative case is essentially the subject of a sentence. The accusative case is the object of the sentence. It receives the action of the verb that the subject is doing. There's also a genitive suffix, which usually shows possession. Something belongs to me, then it is a genitive relationship between me and that thing. Those case endings were vowels. U for the nominative case, A for the accusative, and E for the genitive. Now, Hebrew ultimately lost these case endings. Nevertheless, understanding how these case endings worked in Semitic languages before Hebrew lost it is necessary to understand what's going on in the case of these segolates. All right. So the original form of a segolate had a short vowel that was stressed, and then its unstressed case ending formed the second syllable. So the original form of melech, if it were the subject of a sentence, would be something like malku or malchu. I'm not going to worry about the kaf or begad kefat letters that get a dagesh in them and are pronounced differently, because that was probably a later invention. I'm not going to worry about that here. Let's just call it malku. The u here underneath the kaf is representing the original case ending that was ultimately lost in Hebrew. But the point is that the pronunciation of it, malku, is where that patach, that a vowel, originally comes from. Okay, so the progression from what we see in the Bible, well, from the original form of segolates all the way to what we see in the Bible, works out something like this. The original form of melech was malku. It had a short stressed vowel plus a case ending. Then the case endings were lost in Hebrew, so now we end up with something like malk. So it leaves a consonant cluster on the end of the word, like this lamed and kaf here, which is a little bit difficult to pronounce. Because it's difficult to pronounce, Hebrew added a little vowel in between those two consonants, which then in the next stage gives us this intermediate form of malech, And in fact, this form right here is parallel to what we see in what are called pausal forms of segolates in the Bible. Of course, in the pausal form, it will be spelled with a kamatz, but it still preserves the a vowel in malech. And then ultimately, we get what's called vowel harmonization. Because of the segol that was artificially inserted to break up the consonantal cluster at the end, we're going to get the patach conforming to the sound of that newly invented segol. And this ultimately creates the ultimate form in biblical Hebrew that we recognize, melech. And of course, the final form of kaf. And I didn't worry about including that because, again, it's something that was invented later on. But you can see the resemblance between melech and what we know it as melech. All right, so that means all segolates had an ah vowel in them, right? No. Actually, there were three kinds of segolates, depending on what original short vowel they had. In the example malk, the original short vowel was a patach. But there are two other flavors of segolates, one with a chirik and one with a kamatz katan o vowel, which originally in Semitic languages would have been a short u vowel. I'm going to call these three groups katel, kittel, and kotel. So, for example, melech is a katel form because whenever it adds a suffix, it gets an a vowel in it. Okay, so this is going to show us three different examples. We've already seen malku, how it turned into malech, and eventually melech. And then with its pronominal suffix, we're going to use that malk form and then put on the suffix malko, which means his king. The kittel form is going to have a chirik in it, and here we're using the word beten, which means belly. Its original form with a case ending would be something like bitnu, which turns into biten, and ultimately beten. But then when we add a pronominal suffix, that chirik comes back, bitno, his belly. Now the kotel form, I'm going to put an original u vowel here. Bukro is going to turn into buker, which then turns into boker in biblical Hebrew. Now, vowel harmonization did not take place with these kotel segolates. It preserves this O vowel, usually with a cholam, but then whenever the pronominal suffix is added, like bokro, his morning, this O becomes the original short vowel, albeit O rather than U, and that's going to be with a kamatz katan. We know this, other similar examples would be like kodsho, his holiness. So there are lots of examples of segolates that belong to each of these three categories. I'm giving you a whole laundry list of them here. All of your katel forms are on the left, like even becomes avno, eretz becomes arzo, and so on. The second column has your kittel forms. For example, beged with a suffix becomes bigdo, or berech becomes birko, and so on. You'll notice, like down here, whenever you have a segolate with a tzere at the front of it, like sevel or sefer or zecher, those are the ones that typically will have chirik as the original short vowel. And then in the third column, we get some kotel forms, like ozen with the suffix becomes ozno, or ochel, ochlo, and so on. Okay, so many segolates are actually going to lack a segol vowel or even both segol vowels, depending on what letters show up in it. For example, suppose a guttural shows up in the second or third position. Well, gutturals tend to prefer patachs, patach vowels. If you get a yod in the second or third position, you're going to find chirik to be the more natural vowel because yod and chirik kind of go hand in hand. They sound very similar. Furthermore, if you get a vav in position 2, well, then you're going to usually find cholam or shurik vowels showing up because the original pronunciation of vav was more like a W, which makes a sort of an o sound. Also, you will get some segolates that will preserve their original vowel if one of the consonants is missing. For example, if the second root letter is a noun and it went missing, or if it's a geminate root. I'll show you some examples, don't worry. Okay, so here we're looking at some segolates where one or both of the segols is missing because of gutturals. Here we get the word perach, which is a blossom or a flower, and instead of being pereach, the chet at the end causes the second segol to prefer a patach sound, perach. Same thing with rega. These two nouns, or actually all of the ones that are here under kittel, all have an original chirik, but you can see that that second segol is a patach because of the gutturals. Tseva, rega, resha. And over here with their suffix endings, pircho, rigo, tziv'o, and so on. Here are some kotel forms that also have a guttural at the end. Gova. This is a consonantal guttural H sound at the end, which would have originally been pronounced gova, with sort of a breathy H there at the end. In the suffix form, we'll get kamatz katan, govho. But that guttural still causes what should have been a segol, causes it to prefer a patach instead. Here's another one, roga, suffix form, rog'o. If you get a guttural in the second position, you'll find that both the segols will prefer a patach most of the time. So for example, here we have tsa'ad because of the ayin in the middle, and then its suffixed form, tsa'ado. It's a katel form, so patach is preserved in the suffixed form. Tsa'ado. Here we get ta'am, flavor, ta'mo, or laham, lahat, blaze, and lahato. Now, bread seems to be an exception. Lechem, however, its original vowel was a patach, lachmo. Here's a kotel form, rochav, and rochbo, his width. Now, there are some examples where gutturals come at the beginning in position 1 of the segolate, but we're not going to usually find an irregularity with them, except in these two examples here. In the word chelek, this was probably originally a kittel form with an original chirik. Nevertheless, in the Bible, when there's a suffix on it, a segol shows up. chelko. Now, how do I know that this was probably an original kittel form? Well, go have a look at 2 Kings 18:18. When it shows up in someone's name with a chirik. Nevertheless, chet is probably going to prefer a segol vowel rather than a chirik because of a later dialectic issue. So in biblical Hebrew, it's preserved as chelko, even though it was originally a kittel form. Here's another one, chefetz, with a suffix on the end, is preserved as cheftzo. But again, it was probably a kittel originally, but because of that chet, it's preferring segol over a chirik. All right, we're talking about different kinds of segolates depending on what letters show up. So now let's move on to what happens when a yod shows up in position 2 or 3. Well, typically a chirik would be preferred. Let me show you some examples. We all know the word bayit. Turns out bayit is a segolate. Think about it. It's a 2-syllable noun with penultimate stress. It is a katel form because there's an a patach preserved, even in the absolute form. Yet the second syllable does not have a segol because of the yod. The yod prefers a chirik. So instead of bayit or bayit or something like that, and the Bible preserves bayit. Now in the suffixed form, we're going to get what's called a diphthong reduction. So rather than bayito, it actually preserves and prefers beito. And you'll see that pretty much all of these examples take a tzere because of that diphthong reduction. So bayit, ayil, shayit, zayit, ayin, yayin, chayil, tzayid, layil. Layil is the original form of lila, nighttime. It was originally a segolate, layil. So his night would be lelo. And then mayim, this is a very interesting word because it ends in a mem, which makes this ayim sound at the end, which in Hebrew is the dual plural suffix. So the original word mayim was probably just a singular segolate, but it was understood, or rather misunderstood, as a dual plural. So when we see the word mayim with a pronominal suffix, it actually takes a plural pronominal suffix, even though it probably shouldn't have. If this were to follow all the other words, the pattern of the other words, it probably should have been something like mo. Nevertheless, because of the misunderstanding about mayim being a plural, it gets a kamatz yod vav, which is the plural suffix. His water. Over on the right-hand column, we get some segolates that have a yod in the 3rd position rather than the 2nd. And here we get our segol that we would expect, but the segol, we get our segol under the 1st root letter, but we don't get a segol under the 2nd root letter because that yod pulls it into a chirik sound. So instead of merei, instead it's meri, which is rebellion. So in the suffixed form, we're going to see a tendency. Well, that's not true. We're going to see like these forms here are kittel, so you get a chirik. Miryo or bechi is going to be bichyo, and shevi is shivyo. These are still segolates, but they have a yod in there messing up the vowels. Down here we get some third position yod segolates, but they are kotel segolates. They have that O vowel originally. So yofi a very, very common word in Hebrew, is an O vowel segolate, and that has a yod at the end. In its suffixed form, it will be yofyo, his beauty, yofyo, or koshi, which is difficulty, would become koshio, his difficulty. It's still a segolate, even though it's starting to look less and less like a segolate. All right, here's another category of variations of segolates, words that some of you may not even have ever recognized as segolates. What happens if a vav shows up in the middle of a segolate? Well, it's some interesting stuff. Look, for example, at the word ruach. Bet you had no idea that that was a segolate. The issue here is that rather than taking on an vowel pattern, the vav messes it up, and so we get a preferred shurik or sometimes cholam because of that vav. The word ruach was probably originally a kittel form, but there's no way to prove it. In the suffixed form, we simply get rucho. Chutz is another example of, like ruach, its suffixed form is chutzo. Now, in distinction, I want to draw a distinction between the first group, where the suffixed form has an oo sound, and between that and the second group, which has an o sound in the suffixed form. Because of this vowel distinction, o instead of oo, that's what leads me to believe that the first group was probably kittel originally, and the second group is katel. Why? Well, because the ah sound followed by the original w of a vav would make an ow sound, aw, which in biblical Hebrew turns into an o sound. We see this in all sorts of examples when we get into irregular verb or weak verbal roots in various binyanim, where original aw becomes an o sound. So this was probably originally dawr or something like that, but in Hebrew it becomes dor. And then doro is the suffixed form. Goy is also a segolate. Goyo, his nation. Kol, kolo. Here we actually get an segolate. It's very interesting that it didn't follow the pattern of these other words, tevech, but in the suffixed form, it follows the patterns before, tocho. Same thing with mavet, where it does preserve an ah vowel, again, letting us know that it was probably originally a katel, with a segolate. Mavet becomes moto. Yom, yomo. This word yomo is irregular in the plural. No need to talk about that here. Over on the right-hand side, we have segolates where a letter went missing. Up here, af is a segolate from the root aleph nun pei, and the nun went missing because it appeared at the end of a syllable, anf, and therefore it assimilated into the following letter. Now, we don't get to see that assimilation in the word af, but we do get to see that assimilation when we add a suffix, apo. The dagesh inside of the pei represents the assimilated nun of the root. Instead of anpo, it's apo, the nun assimilated. We also get some geminate roots where the second and third root letter are the same. Here, the root chet tzadi tzadi is preserved simply as chetz. This is a kittel form, so with the suffix, it becomes chitzo, his arrow. Here we get tzad from tzadi dalet dalet, tzido, his side. Down here we get some katel forms. Bet you didn't know that was a segolate. It's from the root ein mem mem. So that's why we get a dagesh in the mem whenever you add a suffix. Ammo, his people. That mem is doubled because the root has two mems in it, ein mem mem. Same with gal, galo, and gan, gano, and pat. It says pito. I wonder if this actually should have been up with the kittel. Sorry for that mistake. Okay, so what? There are three categories of segolates, and all sorts of crazy stuff happens when you get gutturals and yods and vowels and geminates and assimilating letters, yada, yada, yada. But what's the big idea here? Why do there need to be three categories to begin with? All right, I hate to let you down, but there is no clear reason. There is no clear distinction between the three groups. And in fact, most grammarians will simply tell you there's no significance to the three groups. Why some segolates will have ah, some will have e, some will have o in their suffixed forms. Me personally, I tend to think that there is, or at least was, some reason behind the system. And my reasoning comes to me this way. Look, no root, to my knowledge, no root appears in two different groups. Like some arbitrary root, you tend not to find it both in the katel and kittel, or kittel and kotel forms. They all belong to one group. So it seems like there's a reason why it belongs to one group instead of to another. Second reason, verbal roots that tend to convey some sort of state of being idea, stative verb roots, they tend to produce kotel nouns. So I wonder if state of being verbs are usually assigned to kotel forms on purpose. Furthermore, we know that gutturals appear more frequently in kotel forms because gutturals are produced in the throat, which is closer to the vowel patach, ah. Furthermore, kittel nouns are the most common. Well, incidentally, Hebrew has a bunch of sibilant, sorry, I misspelled that there, sibilant consonants, which are pronounced right behind the teeth, which is close to the front of the mouth and therefore closer to the vowel e, e. And besides that, the biblical dialect seems to pronounce much of the language at the frontal palate region, again, where that I sound is produced. Just one last thought about segolates is their plural forms. There's not much interesting to talk about when talking about the plural forms of segolates, except that they're not intuitive, but they are predictable. Look, if you take the word melech and you add the plural suffix im, it should become melechim, or from what we've learned, maybe it should actually become malchim or something like that. I'm so sorry. It actually does something totally different. We get a shva at the front, kamatz under the second letter, melachim. Well, that's weird. Why would Hebrew do that? Well, the best answer that we have is probably because the Segolate plural forms are paralleling another kind of plural in Hebrew, that of nouns. So davar, it's not a king, it's a word. Davar is a word. You add the im, this guy is too far away from the stressed syllable and therefore reduces to a shva, and you get devarim. Now, of course, that's going to be the word words, plural. Devarim is likely the reason that segolates have the plural form that they do. It's not 100% guaranteed, but that's the going theory. Okay, so this has been a lesson on segolates, and to help, this lesson has been to help explain why we see this strange vowel change taking place whenever a suffix is being added to a word with two segols. The key to understanding what's going on here is to know that the suffixed form is actually closer to the original form, and that the two segols that we think are original are actually artificial. I hope you enjoyed this lesson. I hope this has helped lessen the legendary status of the group of nouns called Segholates. Please like and subscribe.